Brave browsers. Okay, share. Okay,
there you go. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, so I'm going to just try and keep an eye on the thing just in case anyone arrives late. If anyone sees anyone arriving late, do let me know. I was just saying, Porrick, to the others that we've just come from the Communist Party of Britain event, which was really terrific, and they had like lots of shindigs and like a proper they had Maxine Peake for like reading aloud from Conditions of the Working Class and stuff like that. So that it was all very, very impressive. So I'm just going to put this participant list over here so I can try and keep an eye on it. I'll just start where, first of all, welcome on behalf of the Dublin Bay North branch of the Workers' Party and the Trinity College Dublin branch of the Workers' Party. We're here on the occasion of Engels' bicentennial, so it's 200 years since his birth, and while he is no longer physically around with us, he is certainly around, because his ideas are certainly around and certainly pertinent. So we're going to start by looking at sort of the most recent event that we could find, and in 2017 the Turner Prize nominated artist Phil Collins, who they also just had at the Communist event of Britain, moved a Soviet-era statue of Friedrich Engels from Ukraine and permanently installed it in Manchester, where Engels had lived and worked for many years. This was a significant gesture, not just because Engels has long been the other guy in Marxist history. Most people think of Engels, if indeed they think of him at all, as a kind of secretary or scribe, the Batman to Karl Marx's, or the Robin to Karl Marx's Batman. Engels himself was content to stand in Marx-sized shadows. How can anybody be envious of genius, he asked. It's something so very special that we who have not got it know it to be unattainable right from the start. He also referred to himself as Marx's second fiddle a lot, and when he was asked about a personal motto towards the end of his life, he famously said, "Take it easy." And I've, in order to illustrate this Robin point, I found the most degrading panel of Robin in the history of DC Comics for you to take a look at. But Engels, who spoke some 24 languages according to his sister, and who was, after all, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto and co-founder of Scientific Socialism, was more than the useless Robin pictured above. He was certainly no intellectual slouch. With Marx, he co-authored not only the Communist Manifesto in 1848, but the Holy Family in 1845 and the German ideology in 1846. His first book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845 and written when Engels was in his early 20s, is an extraordinary, lucid, compelling, far-reaching and still shocking and material account of the negative and crippling impact that the Industrial Revolution had upon the working class. It was groundbreaking enough to inspire Marx to reach out to Engels and to solidify the thoughts in Marx's mind that would eventually percolate into the Communist Manifesto. Rereading it late in his life in the British Library, Marx felt compelled to write to his oldest chum. What power, what incisiveness, and what passion drove you to work in those days? That was a time when you were never worried by academic scholarly reservations. Those were the days when you made the reader feel that your theories would become hard facts, if not tomorrow, then at any rate on the day after. Condition is a work with a significant afterlife. Max Davis, the urban theorist, follows it very closely and pointedly in Planet of Slums, his 2005 analysis of poverty, supercities, and emigration across the world's poorest nations. And we're just going to go down a little bit. We see this nice cover of the Communist Manifesto I found. Should anyone, moreover, require proof that Marxism is not a doctrine, but it's science, I would point them towards Engels' final works. The rigorous material analysis that inspired the Communist Manifesto is translated into mathematical analysis in Engels' 1878 book, Anti-Düring. And apologies, Paulina, about my German pronunciation. I'm sure it's appalling. Marxist ideas, especially those of dialectical materialism, as you all know, being the idea that history progresses through opposing ideas and forces, are applied to mathematics, physics, and chemistry in 1883's Dialectics of Nature. So to the very end, Engels was standing his ground, fighting for what he believed in, developing new applications, and engaging with the newest scientific, political, and cultural ideas of the age. And we would expect nothing more from a man who, as a soldier in the German Revolution of 1848, because remember, Engels was prepared to put his money where his mouth was, distinguished himself as a general, as he was nicknamed, as one of the great theorists of warfare of the 19th century, with a series of anonymously written articles on military organization, weaponry, strategy, and tactics. Despite his excellent efforts on the front line, he didn't refrain from criticizing his bourgeois fellow soldiers. He was outspoken enough, in fact, to get arrested by other revolutionary, and when I say revolutionary, they were revolutionary in this instance in that they were anti-monarchists, but they were capitalist insurgents and bourgeois insurgents. So these capitalists and bourgeois, he felt, would eventually capitulate to the monarchists, or they would sell everyone else out, which they did. You have seen and ever felt, he said, that the bourgeoisie sends the workers into the fire and betrays them afterwards in the most infamous way. And he wrote those words for the Cologne-based newspaper, Organ of Democracy. This incident serves as a good illustration of how Engels' grasp of dialectic materialism allowed him to predict future events. And I think that's an important point to make, that if you have internalized the mechanism of dialectical materialism, it becomes like a Mystic Meg skill set. It allows you to predict the future. Similarly, in an 1888 lecture to his colleague Frederick Sorge, Engels made a chilling prediction of a coming global war. Finally, no war is any longer possible for the Prussia Germany except a world war, and a world war indeed of an extent and violence hitherto undreamt of. 8 to 10 million soldiers will massacre one another, and in doing so devour the whole of Europe until they have stripped it barer than any swarm of locusts has ever done. If anything, of course, those estimates proved to be conservative. Engels, from early in life, was an exceptional man and individual thinker who, even during his misspent youth, excelled at swimming, fencing, poetry, writing, drinking in taverns, and anything else he put his mind to. He was an internationalist. As a German with a Dutch surname that translates as English, he never had any time for nationalism, nor did he have any tolerance for anarchism. The working class must take possession of the organized political power of the state, he wrote, and by its aid crush the resistance of the capitalist class and organize society anew. The anarchists put the thing upside down. They declare that the proletarian revolution must begin by doing away with the political organization of state. But after its victory, the sole organization which the proletariat finds already in existence is precisely the state. The state may require very considerable alterations before it can fulfill its new functions, but to destroy it at such a moment would be to destroy the only organism by means of which the victorious proletariat can assert its newly conquered power, hold down its capitalist adversaries, and carry out that economic revolution of society without which the whole victory must end in a new defeat and in a mass slaughter of the workers similar to those after the Paris Commune. Does it require my express assurance that Marx opposed this anarchist nonsense from the first day it was put forward in its present form by Bakunin? And if you see just up above there, there's a picture of the site of the Hague Conference of 1872, from which Bakunin and his organization were sent away by Marx with a flea in their ear, basically. Sorry, I've got some more people to, just give me a moment. So growing up in a liberal Protestant, very bourgeois household in Prussia, Engels was the apple of his mother's eye. For his father, however, he was the scabby sheep of the family, and with some cause, young Friedrich dropped out of the gymnasium or secondary school a year before graduation. Of course, there was always likely to be conflict with Daddy, who owned textile factories, for reasons that would become increasingly apparent. And there's a picture of him there in his 20s. From an early age, Engels challenged his Wuppertal faith and was struck by the hypocrisies of a bourgeois class that was outwardly pious while inwardly calculating gains from the vicious exploitation of their employees. Engels was moved by the economic disparity he witnessed in his native Barmen and an early industrialized region, often called the German Manchester. He was angered by what he saw in and around the textile industry that made his family rich. Aged 19, he wrote of factory workers in low rooms where people breathe in more coal fumes and dust than oxygen, and the textile industry's tragic byproduct, a class of Karenbinder, totally demoralized people with no fixed abode or definite employment, who crawl out of their refuges, haystacks, stables, etc., etc., at dawn if they have not spent the night on a dung heap or on a staircase. These words are written by a teenager in the 1830s and are all the more remarkable when one considers that factories at this moment in history, say for a few trailblazing projects such as John Lum's water-powered silk mill at Derby, which was operational by 1721, for example, they've only been around for a few decades. The first mechanized factories don't emerge until the very late 18th century, the tail end of the 18th century. So Engels was exposed to even more radical ideas during his military service. Again, the fact that he did military service is not really a duty expected from a young gentleman of his means, and he did his military service in Berlin. While in the military, he began to attend university lectures. He developed an interest in revolutionary and banned works by the young German authors. And it was here as well that he fell in with Hegel and the romance around that philosopher's disciples. The young Hegelians were Republican and liberal. They were citing and idealistic. They wrote cultural criticism, which really only lightly critiqued the monarchy and religious dogma. They accepted the new Hegelian dialectic, which was the thrilling thing of the day, that rational progress and historical change result from the conflict of opposing views ending in a new synthesis. Sorry, I'm getting lost with my pictures. So we have a picture here of the young Hegelians, and of course Marx was in fact one of the young Hegelians, but they didn't in fact meet until later on. Engels' father, alarmed by his son's new communist chums, such as Moses Haas and those associated with the young Hegelian circle of the free, encouraged Friedrich to go to Manchester in England, which is, as it happens, had the absolute opposite effect of what he intended. They didn't have many Hegelians in Manchester in the 1840s, but they did have Chartists. Beginning in the 1830s, Chartism was a mass movement which sought by every legal means to place all classes of society in possession of their equal political and social rights. Now, Engels did have some issues with the Chartists, and in particular, their very doggedly pacifist stance, but certainly that was in the air, along with many pollutants of the industrial Manchester that the intellectually curious 22-year-old Engels arrived in. Manchester is key to Engels' development. As Asa Briggs wrote in Victorian Cities, all roads led to Manchester in the 1840s. Since it was the shock city of the age, it was difficult to be neutral about it. If Engels had not lived in Manchester, his conception of class and his theories of the role of class in history might have been very different. In this case, Marx might not have been a communist, but a currency reformer. The fact Manchester was taken to be the symbol of the age in the 1840s was of central political importance in modern world history. If you see there, this is a picture, if you can see on your screen, an illustration of Manchester in 1865. I have a couple of these just to give you some extent of the scale of the industrialization of Manchester in the late 1800s. In Manchester, where Engels would spend most of the next 22 years, he was right at the heart of a transformed society. From 1842, by day, Engels worked at Emin and Engels' mill in Salford. By night, with his working class Irish lover Mary Burns on his arms, he frequented taverns and Chartist meetings. I forsook the company and the dinner parties, the port wine and the champagne of the middle classes, and devoted my leisure hours almost exclusively to intercourse with plain working men, he wrote. What he discovered, especially in the Irish quarter of the city, not far from Cottonopolis as it was known, was an abused underclass. Women made unfit for childbearing, children deformed, men enfeebled, limbs crushed, whole generations wrecked, afflicted with disease and infirmity, purely to fill out the purses of the bourgeoisie. He was appalled by the child labor, environmental impact, low wages, bad conditions, poor health, death rates, and the extent of social and political power of your oppressors. Your meaning the working class. He noted the mortality rate in the urban centres of Manchester and Liverpool from smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and other diseases was 4 times that as it was in the surrounding countryside. It's also worth noting that Engels' explanations of the etiology of disease in these communities are written decades before Paul Ehrlich's studies of microbiology, which would concur with what Engels' descriptions had, and also lead to the invention of antibiotics. More importantly, however, Engels noted that the Industrial Revolution had left workers significantly worse off and created a sizable underclass who were materially demonstrably worse off than they might have been in feudal times. In 1842, England and Wales counted 430,000 paupers, of whom 222,000 were incarcerated in workhouses, he wrote. Poor law Bastilles, the common people call them, thanks to the humanity of the Whigs. Scotland has no poor law, but poor people aplenty. Ireland, incidentally, can boast the gigantic number of 2,300,000 paupers. And here we have another illustration of Manchester, this one from 1850. And if you can look at that black line across the fit, that's literally just smoke coming from chimney stacks. This reserve army of unskilled and often starving laborers existed against a backdrop in which capitalists pay their workers as little as possible while exacting more work from them. As Engels put it, if a manufacturer can force the 9 hands to work an extra hour daily for the same wages by threatening to discharge them at a time when the demand for hands is not very great, he discharges the 10th and saves so much wages. This leads in turn to competition between workers for jobs and to the creation of a pool of unemployed who can be pulled into the workforce when business is booming and laid off again when it is slack. This created competition between workers, the sharpest weapon against the proletariat in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Without the protection offered by class solidarity or a union, the capitalist class, as Engels note, has gained a monopoly of the means of existence, and which is protected in its monopoly by the power of the state. But this working class, Engels realized, had the power and the numbers to abolish the inhumanity of capitalism, to stand against low wages, the power of employers over non-unionized workers, and the threat of machinery or technology under capitalism. In this respect, it was unlike any other class in history. It had the means to take on the means of production. This radical idea would form the spine of the Communist Manifesto, but today we're not going to dive into the Communist Manifesto. We are instead going to take a look at the origin of family, private property in the state, in which Engels applies the Marxist notion of historical materialism to understanding the family as a social institution. The origin, as we'll refer to it from now on for short, provides a material analysis of how the family as we know it came to be. So it's a very significant text for anyone on the left, and it always has been. Writing in 1895, Clara Zetkin, the leader of the socialist women movement in Germany, hailed origin as being of the most fundamental importance for the struggle for the liberation of the entire female sex. Going down a bit and looking here at Lenin, in a 1919 speech outlining the nature and genesis of the state, Lenin said, "I hope that in studying this question of the state, you will acquaint yourself with Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. This is one of the fundamental works of modern socialism, every sentence of which can be accepted with confidence, in the assurance that it has not been said at random, but is based on immense historical and political material." But you don't have to be a card-carrying communist to love origin. Engels' work was a key text for many second-generation feminists who discovered it in the late 1960s and early 70s. As Kate Millett notes in her seminal 1970 book, Sexual Politics, Engels' treatment of marriage and the family as historical institutions subject to the same processes of evolution as other social phenomena laid the sacred open to serious criticism, analysis, even to possible drastic reorganization. The radical outcome of Engels' analysis is that the family, as that term is presently understood, must go. As a recent article in Jacobin written for the bicentennial noted, contemporary revived interest in Engels' work owes as much to natural science as it does to political science or Marxism. Writing in Natural History in 1975, the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould described Engels' theory of evolution as outlined in Origin and in his unfinished work Dialectics of Nature. Gould argued that Engels gave the best account of human evolutionary history of the 19th century. The best 19th century case for gene culture co-evolution was made by Frederick Engels in his remarkable essay of 1876, The Part Played by Labor in the Transition from Ape to Man, Gould wrote in the New York Times in 1983. And Gould was in turn inspired by Engels to take on on such popular and awful and now debunked 1970s scientific theories as Arthur Jensen's 1969 hypothesis that IQ differences between whites and blacks are genetically based and unalterable. So what lies between the pages of this remarkable far-reaching book? It is an answer, or rather a series of answers, to a question first posed by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. On what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On that occasion, they answered, on capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. The idea of women's liberation was central to the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The bourgeois sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that with communism, the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion that the lot of being common will likewise fall to women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at by the Communist Manifesto is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. And I think this is a really interesting passage when you look at it now, because when you see the kind of reaction that we get among sort of men's rights activists, the kind of nastier end and more toxic end of men's rights activists, where like every single little advance of woman is perceived as some kind of personal threat. I think it's very interesting in that regard. Thus, Marx and Engels developed a theory of women's oppression over many decades, coalescing into Origin. Engels wrote the book after Marx's death, but it was a joint collaboration, a point stressed by Engels, who was ever keen to paint himself as the Luigi of communism. And Engels used Marx's extensive notes along with his own writing. And here we have Luigi. Following the death of his friend Karl Marx in 1883, Engels served as a literary executor and spent like 3 years putting his papers together. He found Marx's extensive handwritten notations on a book by anthropologist Lewis H. Morgan, Ancient Society, or Researches in the Lines of Human Progress from Savagery through Barbarism to Civilization, first published in London in 1877. Marx was enormously excited by this book as he realized its potential importance as a materialist history. There we have a picture of Morgan right there in a copy of the book. To say that Morgan's work was groundbreaking, or that Engels' extrapolations from it were groundbreaking, is an understatement. Just to add another note of context, there were few to no major works of anthropology at this time. There were some, I suppose, cultural anthropology works by people like Tyler, and you're coming into the time of books like the Golden Bough. But when you think about it, like Charles Darwin's On the Origins of Species is only a few decades old at this moment when Engels is writing Origin. So Morgan was a pioneering anthropologist and railroad lawyer who championed the land rights of Native Americans. As an honorary member of the Seneca Iroquois tribe, he observed that the Iroquois had lived in communal longhouses based on matrilinear descent and matrilocal residence, an arrangement giving women much power. Engels immediately realized the significance of Morgan's chronicle of matrilinear life. The rediscovery of the original mother right gens as the stage preliminary to the father right gens of the civilized peoples has the same significance for history of primitive society as Darwin's theory of evolution has for biology, and Marx's theory of surplus value for political economy, he wrote. And what does he mean by this? He means that life was absolutely nothing like you see in the Flintstones. Here's a nice sexist cartoon from the Flintstones that you can read. He means that among prehistoric hunter-gatherers, children were traced matrilinearly because the groups lived with group marriage arrangements, and we use the term marriage very, very loosely here. And it was difficult to know who the father of a child was. The position of mothers as the certain parent of the children secured and demanded a higher social level. We know from prehistoric art and Ice Age art and fertility symbols that women were revered. And we know from the, okay, sorry, Zoom is messaging me. Sorry, Zoom has completely thrown me here. So, yes. Okay, sorry. That women were revered, and we know from the brushstrokes now that they've been studied that women made much of this art, which again puts to bed this kind of notion of like this kind of male guru or shaman figure hanging around the gens or the tribes or the clans. And these communities were egalitarian, production was collective, and ownership was communal. Everyone worked together. Okay. No task was valued as higher than the other. And like, if you think about it for any length of time, why would it be? This idea of the big game hunter is like complete nonsense, because foraging is a far more reliable food supply, and there's simply no motive, therefore, in this environment for men to even attempt to subjugate women. And also fossil records indicate that men who were in any way violent, as Morgan would have seen with the Iroquois tribe, are punished and are excluded and ostracized and sent out into the wilderness to face almost certain death, to be honest. Morgan divides prehistory into three overlapping periods of epochs of social evolution: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. It was at this later stage that the subjugation of women rears its ugly head. Under savagery, our human ancestors appropriated natural products, foraging for fruit and nuts. Under barbarism, our ancestors migrated according to climate and developed early stone tools for food production into hunting and gathering. The third epoch sees the beginning of settlement in villages and were refined tools like, for example, basket weaving. The domestication of animals and agriculture, however, lead to an accumulation of wealth and new social and gender relations. Suddenly it's possible to reduce a surplus to requirements, and with this comes trade and slavery and private property. Citing Engels, Angela Davis notes in her 1981 paper, Women, Race, Class, the Approaching Obsolescence of Housework, a Working Class Perspective, which is a great paper if you ever get to read it. Sexual inequality as we know it today did not exist before the advent of private property. During early eras of human history, the sexual division of labor within the system of economic production was complementary as opposed to hierarchical. In societies where men may have been responsible for hunting wild animals and women in turn for gathering wild fruits and vegetables, and both sexes performed economic tasks that were equally essential to their community's survival. Once the ownership of wealth, however, began to shift from the clan, gens, or communal ownership into private ownership, the family changed shape. Tools which would have been passed back to the mother clan are now passed down to children. Thus comes a need to be certain of parentage, and that can only happen with the absolute subjugation of women and the tearing down of the mother right. As Engels solemnly observed, the overthrow of the mother right was the world historic defeat of the female sex. Under this new order, the woman was trapped. She was of a different clan to her children. She had been pulled away to live with her husband, as well as being a different clan from her husband. She was isolated from her kin in the separate and exclusive house of her husband. Her new condition tended to subvert and destroy the power and influence which descend from the female line that the joint tenement houses had created. Woman, as Engels noted, is an underclass. Is the first underclass. The man took command in the home. Also, the woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became a slave to his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. The first class opposition that appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage, and the first class opposition coincides with that of the female sex by the male. By the time what we think of as Greek civilization becomes manifest, the woman is now property and no better than a slave. And there's also a shift if you look in Greek mythology. The old gods, and which reflects what Engels is talking about, the old gods regarded matricide as the worst possible crime, and the new gods that come in will give you a trial for it, and that's significant. And here we have a picture of the Tamagotchi here, and there's a reason for that. So the origin of the family, private property, and the state was a provocative and profoundly influential critique of the Victorian nuclear family. It goes against all the biological determinism that characterizes major religions of the day and of our day. And it also outlines that the traditional monogamous household is in fact a recent construct closely bound up with capitalist society. societies. In terms of our species and its grander 120,000 year span, the patriarchal family, the idea that man is the head of the household, the notion of woman being the weaker sex, arrives around the same time as the Tamagotchi. Origen argues that the modern individual family is founded on the open or concealed domestic slavery of the wife, that the first condition for the liberation of the wife is to bring the whole female sex back into public industry, and that this in turn demands the abolition of the monogamous family as the economic unit of society. That is a radical idea, but it is one that is rooted in historical materialism. And once more with feeling, historical materialism is a handy two-word way of saying that society's economic organization fundamentally determines its social institutions. Or as Engels puts it, the determining factor in history is, in the last resort, the production and reproduction of immediate life. But this itself is a twofold character. On the one hand, the production of the means of subsistence of food, clothing, shelter, and tools requisite therefore. On the other, the production of human beings themselves, the propagation of the species. And if we go down here, we should have a picture, of Zaretsky. The family as we know it did not always exist. It is a social construct, not a natural way of being, nor has it always been a tool for the continuation of capitalism as it is now. The family in its current form is important for capitalism, obviously because it produces workers, but its very structure justifies inequality, control, and hierarchy, and persuades those within the family that the capitalist system is inevitable. Later Marxist theorists, notably Eli Zaretsky in 1976's Capitalism, the Family, and Personal Life, which builds on Engels' arguments in Origin, even sort of parsing its title, notes that the family is sold to us as a haven away from the exploitation of capitalism, when in fact it cannot adequately nurture the individuals within away from capitalism, as the family itself is shaped and determined by capitalism. As Marx had it, the modern family contains in germ not only slavery, but also serfdom, since from the beginning it is related to agricultural services. It contains in miniature all the contradictions which later extend throughout society and the state. The family reinforces and socializes around the idea of inheritance and private property. Zaretsky adds that the patriarchal family is additionally a source of profit, wherein children and sometimes adults will use pester power to keep up with their peers. The family is designed to, by nature, to accumulate wealth and property and to provide free labor as well in the form of housework. And the idea of something like the family being natural is a very important for the continuation of capitalism. And we've got this little panel here of Zaretsky's ideas. Capitalism depends on the family as it depends on the fallacy of the natural and the inevitable. And it repeats these fallacies ad nauseum until they sound like indisputable truths. So like you hear things all the time like corruption is inevitable, prostitution is the world's oldest profession, men must subjugate women as they're physically stronger than women, human competition is part of our being. And these arguments presented in Origin explode these natural truths. Origin explodes the idea that the patriarchal family is inevitable and exposes the ways, by extension, it exposes the ways in which capitalism in a larger sense persuades us that it is unchangeable and unchallengeable. And here we have a lovely meme that was done for us by our Trinity comrades. It is unfortunate that until the second wave of feminism in the 1960s that Engels, and by extension, Origin, was dismissed, not just as Luigi of communism, but as a Western Marxist, or as an idealist to Marx's materialist. Engels has been attacked as a hypocrite for marrying. As many of you will know, he was romantically involved with Mary Burns, an Irish worker, until her sudden death in 1863. After that, he had a relationship with her sister, Lizzie. Her name was Lydia, but everyone called her Lizzie, whom he married as per her final request hours before her death in 1878. I don't think that the granting of Lizzie's final request undermines any of Engels' arguments against bourgeois marriage, but there a lot of people are out to get Engels. Another stick that has been used to beat Engels comes from a mistranslation in the 1942 edition of Origin. The section discussing ancient Greeks contains the phrase and it's making a point about how degraded women have become that men have to look for sex elsewhere. And they fall into the abominable practice of sodomy and degraded alike their gods and themselves with the myth of Ganymede. Now, if you know the myth of Ganymede, in which the god Zeus kidnaps a beautiful young boy, you'll know that the issue is child sexual abuse and not homosexuality, and those are two very different things. And in fact, many LGBTQ activists on the left have used Engels' arguments about patriarchal marriage not being, natural or inevitable over the years. There are not insignificant reasons, of course, to suppress origin. Related arguments were rehearsed around Robert Bruffaut's encyclopedic 1927 study of the animal kingdom, The Mothers, which caused the London School of Economics, Branislav Malinowski, to dismiss the group motherhood, which was a central part of Bruffaut's study, as a false and dangerous idea. And the LSE really lost the rag over this, even with the suggestion that it was in birds, could be found among birds. In her 1954 article, Anthropology, Marxist or Bourgeois, Evelyn Reed, the great American communist, explains, to declare oneself on the side of the matriarchy as the earlier form of social organization, therefore, is to openly or implicitly declare oneself in agreement with the theory that primitive socialism or communism preceded class society. And that is the rub. To declare that primitive communism preceded class society is to admit that class society did not always exist, and by the same token will not always exist. It is in effect to support the Marxist position and theory. There's a picture of Evelyn Reed there. For this reason, critics have taken issues with all sorts of things. They criticize Engels' outdated science methods in a way that they don't when it comes to, say, Darwin's writings. But as modern readers of Origins will know, it's extraordinary just how much Engels got right. Contemporary studies of continuous Aboriginal cultures, whether in Indonesia or West Africa, confirm the kind of matrilineal structures that Engels wrote about. I'm pictured above just here, if I find this picture, those three women there are from the Minang Kabau ethnic group in Indonesia, which is the world's largest matrilinear society in West Sumatra. And they live exactly as Engels supposed they might. These ideas in turn confirm the central conceit of Origin, that it is only with the overthrow of capitalism and the abolition of private ownership that women can be liberated from patriarchal control. So those are my little notes on Engels, and I'm just going to try and unmute everybody if I can without messing it up. Let's have a look. Okay. No, hang on. Sorry, forgiveness. There we go. I don't know. Hang on. Okay, I need to stop screen sharing. Sorry, I'm just being hopeless. Just don't mind me for a minute. Yeah. Okay. Can people talk?
I think people can unmute themselves.
Yes. Okay. Does anyone want to say anything? Oh, Zoom is just the place where the worst uncomfortable silence space in the world.
When the book was published, like, was there much, like, was there a wide coverage, or was it just within very communist circles that the book was published originally? Like, sort of, what was the progression of the book from the time of publication to our generation?
Well, it was big, obviously, it was big among early feminists. It was big among socialists, but yeah, it's kind of large, like, it's part of what I was saying about Engels when his his reputation has often been maintained more by anthropologists than Marxists, because like they were very, very keen on it, and they regarded it as kind of the finest work of its kind. And you know, it does contain, like, it's very detailed analysis. He really sat down and thought about it. And it's worth noting as well that while he was working from Marx's notes, Marx had a lot of notes about feudalism and slavery, and Engels kind of pushed it off in this other direction. And I think in doing so, he was correct, because he was able to predict and sort of talk about the matrilineal communities to greater effect, with greater emphasis. But yeah, no, it certainly was well recognized among intellectual circles. But I mean, it's a fairly, even though it's a small book, like it's definitely a very specialized work. So it wouldn't have been widely read. I suppose it would have been only really a work passed around among certain circles.
And do you know, in Ireland, we'll say in the early days, we'll say with the early Irish, the Socialist Party of Ireland, or the Irish Republican Socialist Republican Party, you know, with Connolly and that sort of groups, like, is there any record that it was sort of discussed in Ireland
Yeah.
at that stage?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, and I need to do a bit more research into this, but Connolly was definitely influenced by Engels' ideas. He was, and in fact, like Engels and Marx, writing on Ireland was a big influence on Connolly. So they were definitely aware of his writings. And there are, there are points where Connolly, I think talks or has written about Engels, but I'd need to go and dig them out.
Yeah.
It's actually it's definitely something worth pursuing. I mean, I think there's a great book to be done on the Irish connection between Marx and Engels, because they were fascinated by Ireland, and all the more so because Engels had that Irish connection, because, you know, not just Mary and Lizzie, but and a lot of the factory workers that worked under him were Irish, and a lot of the research he did was in that. It's off the what is it, the Church Street in Manchester, which, so you're in the kind of Irish communities there, you're in the kind of Irish slums of Manchester. That's where he did a lot of his research and a lot of his work in order to write The Condition of the Working Class. So there's definitely links there that could make for a really interesting book, I think.
Thanks, Tara.
Yeah. You're welcome.
I'm interested that that you talk about, I think reasonably enough, about him as the Luigi to the Mario, and these various notions of a sidekick, which, if I'm honest, I mean, I wouldn't have been as so demeaning as to call him, I think it was a secretary, but I probably would have thought of him as a researcher. You know, that's in that sort of field to Marxist theorist. Is there to Marxist theorist? Is that going to change? Is there any, is public opinion going to change on that? Is there any possibility of him gaining the recognition that you think he deserves?
No, I think he engineered a lot of that himself. I think, you know, like when he talks about himself, and, you know, towards, even when you're looking at, I think that he writes the fourth preface to the fourth reprint of which, actually, getting back to Por's point, like, it was reprinted quite a few times, Origin. So, but I think the fourth preface he writes, you know, he's still insisting that, you know, that Marx gets kind of, you know, the credit, and that was just kind of something that was in his nature. And maybe it was the fact that he did, you know, come from wealth, and he always wanted to kind of play himself down, and he spent so much time in, you know, like living and working and talking among the working class. And that quote I use, where he just couldn't be bothered with sitting with polite bourgeois society and having nice champagne, you know, when he could have a small beer as like somewhere down a tavern with some chartist, or you know, or sit around watching a brick riot. I think that's part of his makeup. I think that he wanted that kind of anonymity to disappear into, and I think that was I think it's like he wanted to be proletarian, like he wanted to be part of a larger group, and he kind of disliked the idea. He certainly disliked individualism as a trait within himself and suppressed it.
Yeah.
Is the sense that I get.
Yep.
Yes. Does anyone else have anything else to say? Okay, well, if that's us done, well, I hope this.
Yeah, just in relation, when you're talking about the family, you're talking about Engels, in Manchester, that closeness to the Irish women or whatever. Did he ever run into any conflict in that regard with the church? Particularly talking about the family.
Well, he
and
never.
the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been he never at any time, like even as a young man, he used to have furious rows with his sort of young teenage friends that he used to like fence and ride with about faith, and that was his departure from really the young Hegelians who were still quite reverent around church and monarchy in a way that he was not. I'm not sure about his specific opinions on the Catholic Church. I think he dismissed the whole lot of it as a load of bunkum from the get-go. So it's but at the same time, like being Irish Catholic was hardwired into Lizzie, and so he was content to go along with her marriage request in the end, even though I don't know, she died minutes later, so it doesn't. It wasn't really much of wasn't really a long marriage anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers the question. I hope it does.
Yeah.
Josh?
I was going to ask, you were talking about people saying that Engels was an idealist as opposed to Marx as materialist, and it's like, just following on, like, on what grounds and who said it, that kind of thing. It seems like just kind of a weird thing that's been hanging around.
It is a weird thing. I mean, I was that article I was talking, bicentennial article in Jacobin, goes into some detail about this really weird notion that springs up in the 60s of Western Marxism, and it's this somehow separate. It's this idea that there's Marxism that's like Marx, and then there's this kind of bad airy-fairy Marxism, and it's like Engels. And I guess it might be related to the fact that because he was so involved in so many other scientific fields like mathematics and physics and chemistry, and and he was studying patterns in nature and all of those things, I think maybe it's like, well, that's just some kind of intellectual stuff. But yeah, no, there's definitely there's definitely a lot of detail in that current Jacobin article about this idea of Western Marxism, which happily kind of disappeared. But yeah, there were certainly theorists, Marxist theorists in the West who were sitting there calling Engels Western Marxism. So go figure that. And also that what this branch of the branch of communism, humanist communism, that sprung up in the United States in the early 20th century. That was another branch then that got somehow lumped in with Engels in the grander narrative of Marxism, when in fact it was all Marxism. It's just that and Engels would not have had it any other way. He was never going to go for the idea, as we were saying earlier, of calling it Engelsism, and it wouldn't have fitted very well either. Yeah. So I think if we're all done with questions, we can wrap up. And I'd like to say, first of all, thank you all for coming. I hope this was of some use. And I would actually like to say happy birthday to Engels, because I think his writing is terrific. I hope his reputation I hope his stock does get a little bit higher in the future, around the time that we become a communist republic. I'm pretty sure that it will. And